Oh, okay. Woo. Hello. Apologies for the wait. And sorry you'll have to change your name. I realize there's only, I didn't know that's how that works. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay. That's really funny. I've seen a lot of things happen, but not that yet.
I was like, why am I in? I was about to remove you. I was like, why am I in here so many times? Let me make sure you all have sharing abilities. Sorry I wasn't able to be on sooner. Did you all get what you needed?
Yes.
Okay.
We just needed to have some time to talk through things, I think, and make sure we had all of our, I's dotted and T's crossed.
Perfect. Perfect.
So I think we're good.
Good, good, good. All right. We'll probably start letting folks in the next minute or so. You all have sharing abilities if you need a PowerPoint situation.
Yeah. Are we, just one question, are we just kicking it off or are you doing it?
Sorry. I'm going to kick us off. I
Okay.
apologize. What I'm going to do is I'm going to kick us off. I'm going to invite people to share their names and where they're from in the chat. I have a very brief PowerPoint that just kind of says, hi, we're Alliance of Baptists. This is what we do. And then I'll pass it off to you all. And then I'll say if anyone has any questions, like just drop it in the chat and I'll gather them. And then at the end, I'll say those questions or comments, and then you all can open the floor. Or if you have questions in between, you can do that. But I'll try to crowdsource it so you don't have to keep checking the chat or whatever. And I can tell you at the end the answer.
Okay, great. I think there are a couple spots where we're going to pause and give them a chance to drop stuff, but
okay.
If you can capture like bigger questions that that happen along the way, that would be really helpful. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll just take notes and try to capture everybody. And then at the end, when you all are done, I'll just close with like next steps for Alliance of Baptists and Thrive, and it will close out.
Sounds good.
Perfect. All right, I'm going to start letting folks come in. Hello, hello, everyone. If you would, you can drop your name in the chat and where you're from, either your congregation or your city or both. Checking. All right. Give folks a few minutes to come in. Welcome to the new folks in the room. Feel free to drop your name in the chat, city or your congregation where you're from. Right. Welcome, Carol. Feel free to drop your name in the chat, city/congregation that you're from. We'll still give folks another minute or two. All right. As folks are still coming in, I do not have my usual tech support. So I seem a little all over the place, just bear with me. But I'm gonna be letting folks in and then also gathering things in the chat as we go along tonight. Another person coming in. But I want to go ahead and get us started kind of soon, just because I want to give Lyndsey and Constance all the time they need to share with us all of their wonderful work. So I'm going to kick us off / pay attention to people in the waiting room. So we'll do a little bit of both. And I have decided to start the Prophetic Imagination series with a little bit about the Alliance of Baptists and the Thrive work, because I think that's kind of a helpful frame for why we are all here. So my name is Reverend Alexis Tardy. I'm the Thrive coordinator for Alliance of Baptists, which means I get to work with several of the congregations in the Thrive cohort who are focused on anti-racism and justice efforts in their congregations. It's a 4-year program, and I'm kind of just here to help cultivate that work. And as a part of that, we have the Prophetic Imagination series, as well as like Thrive gatherings and hopefully soon Thrive workshops as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So many of you, and if you are just now coming into the room, please share your name in the chat and the city you're from and the congregation you are a part of if you would like to. So the Alliance of Baptists Covenant and Mission, for those of you that this is redundant, I apologize, but I think it's a helpful framework for why we're here. So the Alliance of Baptists says we are a people of faith formed by a long tradition of dissent and historic Baptist freedoms. Celebrating this heritage, we seek to cultivate beloved community, claiming our identity within the body of Christ in the world and our solidarity with all creation. We welcome and affirm all persons with full respect to gender, sexual, racial, and ethnic identities. We hold space for all persons with varying abilities, social standings, or economic status. We lament that over time, many of us have contributed to systems of racial, social, economic, and environmental injustice, privileging some while excluding others. As Baptists, we confess that we have cherished independence from one another more than responsibility to one another, and have allowed systemic injustices to flourish under the banner of individual freedom. We repent and seek transformation. Embraced in baptismal waters, we freely gather to follow the radical way of Jesus. As disciples, we pledge to wrestle with scripture and community, practice shared leadership, preserve local church freedom, and promote religious liberty. So the Alliance of Baptist co-directors are the wonderful Carol Collins and Elijah Zayu, who I get the pleasure of working with them, as well as all of the Alliance of Baptist staff, and it has been a pleasure to do so. As I mentioned, I am the Thrive coordinator, so I get to work with the Thrive cohort. That is 26 congregational partners, as well as our sociologist team, in a 5-year project to actively confront structures of racism in order to remove a crucial obstacle to congregational thriving. We believe that the church will thrive as it commits to working to the thriving of all, no exceptions. These are some of the objectives, basically to explore and understand race-based privilege, and then to use Baptist theological resources to do that. And as you can see here is the Thrive core team, as well as our resource team. And the Prophetic Imagination series supports the Thrive work, as well as all of the Alliance of Baptist congregations. So if you are just now coming in, please drop your name and your city and congregation in the chat so we can get to know you a little bit more. I am going to pass it over here shortly to Reverend Lyndsey, as well as Minister Constance. We are super excited to have them tonight. As we've been talking about anti-racist efforts and work, we have also been talking about the issues that intersect with racism, which is not simply racism, but what are the ways that that affects environmental justice, reproductive justice, and all of those things. And so we want to make sure that we bring people alongside us who can help us to understand those things. So I will allow Reverend Lyndsey and Minister Constance to introduce themselves, but I will briefly share a little bit about their work. Reverend Lyndsey brings 20 years of anti-oppression education, program implementation, capacity building, and relational organizing. They have also worked at Planned Parenthood, Vanderbilt Divinity School, GLSEN, and are currently at Sacred Spiritual Alliance of Communities for Reproductive Dignity. They also serve on the board of directors for Sister Song, Women of Color, Reproductive Justice Collective. Thank you, Reverend Lyndsey. And Minister Constance is a radical sexuality and reproductive health educator, minister, and pursuer of justice. She is the founder and executive director of Reconcile and Reclaim Collaborations, LLC, which strives to restore the unity of sexuality and faith. So I am so excited to have them both here today. And without further ado, I will pass it over to them.
Thanks so much, Alexis. And thanks for hosting us and inviting us into this tonight. I'm really grateful that a conversation we started in the fall has blossomed into this. I'm going to screen share in just a minute and get into the PowerPoint in just a minute. But before I do that, I want to say hi to all of your faces. There are some folks who I've never met in the Alliance, and there are folks who I am very familiar with. So it is good to see all of y'all gathered. I am a member of the Alliance, and I get to introduce y'all to my beloved friend. And we were just talking about how long ago it was when we were in seminary, a seminary and sex ed, reproductive justice, brilliance colleague, Constance. And we'll tell you a little bit more about ourselves, but I am so glad, Alexis, that you read the statement of who the Alliance is, which I don't think is a thing that we regularly are grateful and excited about when people are reading the mission statement and whatnot. But it's so apropos of where we're going to go tonight and what we're going to talk specifically the idea of repenting and transforming, and that being an active process, not just a thing that just sort of happens or is one and done. The invitation to wrestle with scripture, definitely a thing we're going to do a little bit tonight, and to share leadership. Those things are core to how reproductive justice comes alive. So it's really exciting to think about the ways that the Alliance has grown and changed and developed, and what it means to actually live a very active, justice-seeking, Jesus-following faith. So thanks for that. All right, without further ado, I'm gonna bump into the PowerPoint and we'll get really introduced.
While Reverend Lyndsey is pulling that up, if you all have any questions or thoughts or comments along the way, feel free to throw those in the chat, and then I'll just gather them for when it's time for questions.
Thank you, Alexis. All right. Can folks see it? Can I get a thumbs up or thank you? Perfect. Just want to make sure. I'll tell you just a little bit more about me, then I'm going to pass it on to Constance. We'll talk a little bit more about what we're going to do. I was ordained at Glendale Baptist in Nashville in an Alliance congregation, but I grew up Presbyterian. And I have been wandering around these questions of faith, gender, and sexuality, I think since I was a kid in a small town in rural Ohio. That's it's just sort of at the core of what it means to try and figure out what it means to be faithful for me. And so I just keep following it. I'm currently working at an organization called Sacred Dignity. Betty, I see you on this video, and so I'm going to shout you out. Betty is helping working with a group of folks in Charlotte, North Carolina, and they're going to host a Sacred Dignity training in a few weeks. So I will say this: Sacred Dignity is an organization that is focused on working in spaces of faith, in multiple faith spaces, and in multi-faith spaces, to do the work of building a world where reproductive freedom and reproductive justice are a reality. We're a relatively new organization, but we're doing that hard and beautiful work that the Alliance is familiar with, of figuring out how we wrestle with and make our congregations alive with the transformation we hope to see. I will drop a link because I hope maybe a couple of you will consider joining Sacred at our gathering in May. So I'm going to drop a link to that. You can also find out more about the organization that way. So that's a little bit about who I am. Constance, who are you?
Good evening. There's a great question. So my name is Minister Constance Dunlap. I am from Lima, Ohio. And as Lyndsey said, we met at Vanderbilt Divinity School. So I had the pleasure of meeting Lyndsey, and we've been friends since. And who knew we didn't really realize we only lived like 40 minutes from each other, our birthplaces. So it was destined. But I have been similarly after this conversation around identity and around how people navigate sexuality, their identity, their gender, and faith. I grew up in a National Baptist context and am now duly aligned with American Baptist, but certainly grew up with an absence of conversations around sexuality and faith, and particularly around pleasure. And so I'm super excited now to be in this field and to be able to have these conversations with you all. So yeah, I've been doing this for over 15 years. I guess Lyndsey and I counted, it's probably closer to 20. I'm a Baptist minister. I work also in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a Baptist, it's important for me to let you know that I am saved, sanctified. It's in process, I'm still working on it. Holy Ghost saved and fire baptized with full submersion, because we're Baptists and otherwise it don't count. And so, and I am, as Lyndsey said, the executive director of Reconcile and Reclaim Collaborations, which works toward building this bridge between sexuality and faith, and making it not so they don't antagonize each other. There's a way for us to live in harmony around sexuality and faith. So that is me.
Yeah. So together we're going to do some connecting between the history and the tenets of reproductive justice and biblical and theological understandings. And then we're going to explore some practical ways and reasons that this might connect to your anti-racist work, or how you might connect your anti-racist work to reproductive justice work that's already happening.
So just want to take a quick moment to say, if people have questions, please feel free to drop stuff in the chat, to interrupt us, raise a hand or whatever. I'm a very big proponent of interactive sessions. It just makes it easier on all of us if we talk to each other. So please, by all means, feel free to do that. Also, if anybody has a question and they wish to ask it anonymously, you're welcome to direct message probably Alexis or myself or Lyndsey, and ask those things as well. I have captions turned on my Zoom, so if anybody needs captions, I go ahead. I mean, they are activated, so that is helpful for folks who need captions.
Thanks for taking good care of the space and the room, Constance. So this agenda is like, if we were going to do a full hour and a half, which is what we originally dreamed of, but we know that may not happen tonight, and we can definitely condense sections, and a lot of that is really about discussion. So just know that we're really working on that somewhere around an hour timeline, but know that if folks want to stick around, there's some capacity for more conversation. And the other thing we sort of want to forecast for y'all is what we're talking about when we're talking about reproductive justice. And I'm going to dig into this more deeply, but we are talking about a whole framework, like a whole revival Constance talked about the last time, or the first time we were talking about this, like an entire world changing framework, viewpoint, system, structures, everything. Sometimes when people hear reproductive justice, they think of it sort of small, like not small, but specific at like reproductive rights and reproductive health. If reproductive justice is a lived reality, we're talking about a whole reordering of what is possible in this world, and a way that centers whole lives, whole people, and particularly the needs of Black women. And there are some folks, particularly some white folks, who are like, oh, who have like this like gut hook when I say we're centering the needs of Black women, or broadly talking about centering the needs and wisdom and leadership of Black women, Black Indigenous women, and women of color generally. And I also oftentimes will expand that even more, talking about trans folks and gender expansive folks. But here's what we know. Right now, the world is not built to serve any of those folks I just named. So what this asks us to do is to think really, not to think, to dream, to vision a new possibility that takes absolutely seriously what those folks need and takes seriously what they say they need, whoever they might be, right? It can be a whole bunch of different folks in positions. And one of the places where this idea is codified and is what super helpful for folks to have as a reference point in anti-racist work and in reproductive justice work is the Combahee River Collective. And there's a whole bunch of brilliance there, but one of the nuggets is that if the entire world were built so that Black women were free, safe, could thrive, their children and their families could thrive, then everyone would be able to thrive. And so that's at the core of what it means to follow the leadership of reproductive justice leaders and this whole framework that we're going to talk about today. Underneath all of this, basically when I'm talking about anything, you can ask Amy A. from Chapel Hill about this. Basically, if I'm saying any of these things, I'm also inherently talking about the ways that white Christianity, white Christians nationalism, Zionism, white Christian supremacy, all of those things are at play, and the ways in which our faith has been weaponized to be used for colonization, genocide, enslavement, capitalism, etc. So that like pushing back against that and RJ giving us a new vision of what's possible are always at play in this conversation. Constance, would you add anything? All right. So before I dive into saying more about reproductive justice, we're going to hand it actually over to one of the founding mothers of reproductive justice, Loretta Ross. I'm going to let her explain things first, and I'll add some more context so that we can know what we're talking about.
Black women created in Chicago in June of 1994 because we were impatient with the pro-choice, pro-life binary that failed to adequately express what we needed from reproductive politics. So basically, we joined with the pro-choice movement in fighting for the right not to have a child. And so that includes support for abortion, birth control, and abstinence, if you can hold on. I mean, abstinence, right? Anyway, but because we were Black women, always subjected to thinking that we have too many babies, we have to fight for the right to have the children that we want to have and the conditions under which we want to have them. So that means refusing an unnecessary C-section or having your birth plan respected when you go to the hospital, or using a midwife or a doula if you prefer. And then the third tenet is the right to raise our children in safe and healthy environments, because neither the pro-choice nor the pro-life movement focuses on what happens when the baby is here. And so the right to have a child, not to have a child, and to raise your children are the three core tenets of reproductive justice. Well, reproductive justice.
Make sure she doesn't keep playing underneath. Actually, let me go back here. Great. There we go. Okay. So let me back up to the very beginning. Loretta Ross is one of 12 Black women who named and identified the framework of reproductive justice. They met over a chunk of time, but primarily this, sorry, and slideshow kicked out. There we go. This naming happened in a hotel room in a conference, a reproductive rights conference. as they were talking about and naming the complications of trying to do the work, and that the work that was happening wasn't enough. It wasn't anywhere near what Black women specifically needed. A lot of the time when we're talking about reproductive justice, folks will name this moment as crucial because it is the naming, and also look back and know that reproductive justice work as a whole has been visioned and led by folks across most of human time, right? But if we're thinking about Black women leading, we can think about granny midwives all throughout the South and Appalachia who are making sure that babies of all sorts of humans were coming into the world safely, and who held all of the knowledge of how those pregnancies could happen, could come to life, and when they needed to, how they could end, how to handle miscarriages, how to handle bringing up a kiddo. All of that, so much of that wisdom lived in Black granny midwives for a whole host of time, until white doctors came and basically took it, stole it violently. Whole other story. We could do a whole 2 hours just on that. Anyways, or we can look at indigenous wisdoms, or all sorts of other like folks of color who've been pushing back against colonialism, who've been figuring out how to make a world that thrives for them. That is at the core of that. History is at the core of reproductive justice. And then we get the naming in the 90s from these 12 women. It is at its core, it is a human rights framework. Loretta will tell you that over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. This is human rights. It is about human rights, that human rights and reproductive justice are entirely linked, and you cannot have one without the other. It is at its core about bodily autonomy. And which bodily autonomy then brings in realities around absolute race and gender and sexuality, but it also brings in environmental justice, it brings in disability justice, it brings in financial justice. All of these other pieces all can come in when we're talking about what does it mean for a person to have full control without manipulation, without coercion of their body, their whole body, including their pleasure. And it's a call to world transformation. This is a quick way of making the distinction between reproductive rights, health, and reproductive justice. So oftentimes when we hear reproductive health, sometimes people think that that's the whole thing, right? Reproductive health is specifically connected to the health aspects of reproduction particularly. Sometimes it's expanded a little bit and to include things like sexuality education or trans and gender affirming care. But this is just around health, healthcare, bodies, those sorts of pieces. Reproductive rights is particularly focused on legal and constitutional frameworks for protecting rights specifically. But reproductive justice stipulates that the oppression is real, that it's happening in intersections of multiple oppressions for folks. And without paying attention to all of those complicated issues, then we will never actually have health or rights in general, and we won't have the world that we dream of. These things all work together, right? These are different movements, different pieces of the movement that all work together. And what I will say for myself, my own faith, my own ministry as it connects to this, it is reproductive justice that also aligns and gives me the structure, the power, the possibility models of what it means to follow transformatively Jesus's example and or the possibilities of justice that we see in our faith and our text.
The cool thing for me about reproductive justice is because it is such a more robust approach and framework for viewing the world, it does allow folks to enter in various spaces to do the work of justice. Whereas reproductive health care, as Lyndsey said, is really about, are the body parts well? Are the systems well? Do people have access to the medications, to the things that they need for their, physical state to be well? And I think a lot of times reproductive health and reproductive rights become more reactive than proactive, and again, are not necessarily connected to the wholeness of our lives. And so that's the beauty of reproductive justice that it's again a whole approach to a life, in to life in general, and that it's not again kind of just steeped in the emergencies of, oh, somebody's taking our rights, or oh, we need to defend them. It's an ongoing thing.
If we lived in a world where reproductive justice is a reality, we would have a whole different ethical and values framework for all the things that the rights that we are so-called fighting for right now, right? We would have a different values framework around housing, around medical care, around schooling and childcare, like everything. Like, and this can be overwhelming, I think, for some folks, but for me, it also feels really magical and sacred to be like, oh, we can rework all of this, and we can call on our faith to do it. Like, I only do this work because of my faith. Like, and that feels really hopeful and exciting for me. Even right now, which is a time I would argue is not like the most hopeful or the most exciting, for a whole host of reasons. This feels like a possibility to me, a sacred possibility. So we talk about the tenets of RJ. You heard Loretta say 3. Those are the 3 founding tenets: the right to our own bodies, the right to have children or not have children, the right to parent in safe and sustainable communities. There are some places where you'll see these pulled apart into 4 tenets, just as a way to sort of like give emphasis to both parts of the right to have children and right not to have children. Still the same core ideas. This version comes from Sister Song's Visioning New Futures for Reproductive Justice. Also, we have a slide at the end of this with all the links, so we can send it to Alexis and make sure she can send it out to folks, so you will get that. So from the 4 tenets, if we're looking at these 4 tenets, we see the bodily autonomy part in the very first one, right? The human right to own our own bodies and control our future. If you're familiar with reproductive justice, you will hear a lot of like ability to like actually control what happens. Excuse me, disability justice. Sorry, talking just a little too fast. The realities around like the ways folks who are disabled are talking about claiming and reclaiming power for their own bodies. You can see the overlap right there. We can think about the history of genocide and enslavement in the US and how bodily autonomy and any of those things happening individually or to communities are not what we've been living in. There's the pulling apart of the right to have children, which Loretta Ross named so clearly as like for communities, for people who are told that they shouldn't have children, they're considered less than human in some way, shape, or form, right? The right to have children, to build families as makes sense for that person's community, that person's connections. Like, that is a right we have to fight for. Yesterday, now I'm gonna say it's Oklahoma, something else terrible happened in Oklahoma. It was Alabama. Declared that frozen embryos are children. It will dramatically change the realities of IVF for folks. And even if people can have lots of values around that, and I respect that, and it is a direct attack on this idea of folks having a right to have children, right? That just happened yesterday. The right to not have children. Clearly, this is about abortion, but it is about so much more than abortion. What would our world look like if the nuclear family wasn't the primary way in which we organized our communities? What would change, right? What if it was totally normal for folks to be single and not have children, or couples to be single, or other arrangements of people to collectively raise children, but individuals not have them? There's just all sorts of ways we can blow this up. And then the last one here is the right to parent children, the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And I'm going to ask you all to put in the chat what you think this means. Like, how does this come alive, or how does this hit the ground for folks? So you might give an example of like what a safe and sustainable community could look like. you might tell us a story about why it is hard to feel like all of our communities are safe and sustainable right now for our families. From Carol, I see living wages, worker-owned co-ops, universal health care, good housing, fully funded public schools, free colleges. Yeah, those are some things that would make life a lot more sustainable for a whole lot of folks. Absolutely. Sorry, I said that was just Carol. It might have been Rick. It was from Carol and Rick. Good childcare you added. Alexis added caring for people as humans and is fully autonomous, and the importance of caring for children after birth. Absolutely. See equity in law enforcement. Amy adds, it means the reality of the fact that there is enough for everyone shows up in housing, healthcare, quality education, safe neighborhoods, on and on. Nora adds, where housing, education, childcare, and healthcare are accessible to all. Absolutely. Excellent job, y'all. I would add that if we think about mass incarceration rates that particularly target Black and Brown communities, if we think about the realities of immigration and detention in our world right now, in our country right now, I shouldn't expand. Those don't create safe, sustainable communities for folks, right? And when we dig into it, some of us have been trained to be like, but those things keep us safe. When we dig into it, one, that's actually not true. And two, folks are actually regularly being targeted for not having done anything and then having their lives blown up by the process of incarceration, by the process of detention. We could keep going. We could talk about gun violence, right? And the realities of that in the US. We could go on for this forever.
I would also just add to that, right? So those are big things, and yes, that's reproductive justice, and reproductive justice concerns itself with like safe, sustainable communities. So that it goes to ecology, like where are things happening? Like how are a lot of times smaller communities, communities of colors are located near refineries and factories and things that pollute the air and the water. And here in Ohio, we have a huge problem with lead paint in walls in older houses. So you have a lot of kids in Cleveland who are dealing with lead-based medical issues. So remember, that's why it's a whole life, a whole community of kind of framework, because it's looking at, again, all the ways in which life is challenging and sustainable, particularly for people of color.
Absolutely. Flint, drinking water, like we could keep going.
Yeah.
There's one that's not on here that has been added in the last several years. For some folks, it goes back under the right to our own bodies and control our future. For other folks, it's getting added as a specific tenet, and that is the right to pleasure. And this can feel, for some folks, are like, oh, that feels like pleasure means like something I'm not supposed to necessarily be connected to. But one of the reasons that folks are adding it, that particularly reproductive justice leaders are adding it, are one, not only is the right to pleasure something that has been manipulated and denied to large swaths of people, it is also the idea that we don't deserve to feel good is also used as a way of controlling us. And Black, and particularly in the US, I'm going to be very specific. We think about the history of the US. Black and Indigenous folks were certainly not given space, allowed to experience pleasure in ways that were actually for them across a whole host of different methods, right? Whether we're talking about forced removal from communities or the realities and terrors of enslavement, like there are core ways in which our whole capitalist colonialist system is built so that we are disconnected from pleasure. Faithfully, like my tradition, right? I grew up Presbyterian, I'm now Baptist. I have a long idea of shame and pleasure connecting. And so part of the tenet of adding pleasure to this is also taking it, like challenging that shame idea and thinking about not just one person's pleasure, But what does a collective sense of pleasure look like? If everyone can fully enjoy their bodies, can fully communicate and consent and name what they need and want, what happens? Whether that's sexual or in our relationships with our friends or in our relationships in a congregation, if we are able to think collaboratively about a world where human pleasure is a piece of it, it's a thing that we've normalized, again, what might change?
I'm a real big pleasure advocate. It's growing in me, and I think it's also us reclaiming our theological rights. So it's a step in decolonizing the Bible. Like, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and God said it was good. And goodness is pleasure, right? It's pleasurable. It brought God pleasure to create the things, including human beings. So I think about that in terms of being able to embrace pleasure is a step toward re-embracing original design and God's intent before all the stuff hit the fan.
I don't know if I've ever heard you talk about that, Constance, but man, like, yes, all of that. If I was a shouting person or if I was sitting next to you.
Yeah, I'm learning more about pleasure as I'm trying to figure out my own life. Just, so the thing that's beautiful about reproductive justice is it's a restorative framework, right? And so as I think as a Black woman, as I think about my own life and trying to figure out who I am, what I am, and how I should impact the world, I keep trying to do the things that people tell me I should do, and keep trying to do the things that have been taught to me are the respectable things as a Black woman for me to do. What I'm finding is that where I come alive, and where most people come alive, is where we find our passion and we find the things that bring us pleasure. So, and same thing with relationships, same thing in our bodies, right? The more we can come back to leaning into pleasure as a theological good, as a relational good, as a communal good, I feel like it actually does bring us back to the divine and to each other in a different way.
Okay, I've got just a couple more slides and we're gonna pass it to Constance, but we want to connect some of these ideas that we're talking about, these tenets, to some scripture. Big caveat, footnote, what have you. We are not saying that the Bible is like a manual for reproductive justice. Actually, the Bible is not a manual for anything and should not be used as such. But what we are saying is that we can have conversations with the text and with our faith and with our experience and with our questions with reproductive justice in mind and with reproductive justice as our lens or our framework. Some of those stories are going to be hard, and some stories have a whole host of possibility if we just read the text beyond what we've been sort of told or forced, sort of like manipulated into. Good Alliance of Baptist Bible reading is really what I'm talking about here. And for this slide, I actually want to start at the bottom because we were talking about pleasure. My favorite text in all the text is Song of Songs. My favorite facts about Song of Songs. One, the couple that we see in Song of Songs, though it's it could be a few people, but there's an idea of a primary couple, a narrative couple. They're not married. They are absolutely enjoying each other's bodies and the pleasure that is happening around those things. They're definitely folks of color, and they have both community support and community pressure and displeasure. But in there is absolutely not just sexual pleasure, relational pleasure, pleasure from community, all sorts of things right there in the middle of the text. It's my favorite. Spend some time with it. It might make you uncomfortable. That's okay. All right. If you want to think about the right to our own bodies, our ability to control the future, one place you might think about this through a reproductive justice lens is to think about the ways that eunuchs show up throughout the stories. The idea that Jesus, I'm just looking at Jesus examples, Christian examples, Jesus talks about eunuchs being born, they become, and that they are made. What we know is that eunuchs in the time, though we cannot say that that eunuchs and transgender folks now are the same thing. We do know that folks who are eunuchs are outside of the gender norms. They're outside of the gender expectations. It is another thing, something outside of the binary. Jesus naming them, and naming them not just like, yes, eunuchs are made, eunuchs become, but talking about them as an example of what it means to be faithful. What does that do to our concepts of controlling our own bodies, controlling our future, and still being able to be faithful? The first Christian convert is the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts. Again, another question of if what we have been taught is that our bodies are things that we have to conform and shove into a particular binary narrow space. What does looking at the eunuchs in the biblical text do for expanding what that might mean? I will tell you there are tons of trans writers in particular who have written about these ideas and how it actually expands the possibilities. Austin Hartkey is one of them, has a whole book. But there are a whole bunch of folks who I would recommend. I would also recommend the Black Trans Prayer book. Those are really awesome places to look at this a little bit more. If we want to talk about the right to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities, we might look at the tale of Moses' adoption. We might look at the ways that which early Christian communities worked together to try and make sure everyone had the things that they need. We might look at Jesus and the practices of community care that he demonstrated and the places where he leaned toward justice. I will also say I look to Jesus for when he screws up and when he calls a woman and her child equivalents to pigs, and that woman calls her out, and Jesus actually has to learn and change and be corrected. Because that is part of community care too. And it is helpful to remember that even Jesus, who we have lifted up in all these ways, didn't have it all right. It helps me keep my ego in check. The last bit, the right to have children and not have children. We've got stuff all over the text. We could look at the midwives in Exodus. We could look at Hannah and Samuel. We can look at the Shumanite woman. We can look at all sorts of places all over the place. And in that, what we're not going to find in the Bible is an actual statement that says abortion is wrong. That we won't find there. There are two passages that could be maybe about abortion. One's really about a loss of a pregnancy at the hand of another person, which is not an abortion. And the other is maybe a priest being like, yes, this is how an abortion could happen in this situation as a judgment. But we don't have, despite what we have been told by the religious right, an anti-abortion stance. In fact, the Southern Baptist Convention for a long time supported the folks' ability to access abortion safely. We could do a whole other this is a workshop, Alexis. We could do a whole thing about how the focus on reproductive rights and reproductive freedom, and LGBTQ issues were ways to take the reality that particular power brokers could no longer be overtly racist and transfer a race-based practice into these two other focused ideas for political gain. Just how we got the hostile takeover in the Baptist Convention in the 80s and a whole host of political and religious shiftings. But what we could look at for abortion and faith is we could look at the clergy consultation service. Before Roe was before Roe was decided in 73, there were hundreds of clergy all across the country who were secretly working together to make sure that people had access to abortion services. They're called the clergy consultation service. It is oftentimes not known, but there were Baptists, there were Episcopals, there were Quakers, there were Jews, there were Muslims, there were folks all in all sorts of nooks and crannies who are making sure that folks had access to care. There's a version of that coming alive again soon or now, because we need it. It will look different and it will work really closely with the abortion networks that already exist, but it's happening. We can look at our Jewish siblings and the Midrash, both the process of Midrash, so wrestling with and questioning the scripture, and the Midrash texts that talk about the right of preserving the person who's pregnant's health and well-being over everything else, and the right to ending a pregnancy up to a particular time. We can even look at some Catholic saints and Catholic folks, and some of our history folks who have helped people get access to abortion in a whole host of ways, either maybe magically, faithfully, or maybe through concrete means. So that's why I had Bridget of Kildare here. We've got all sorts of stuff. We just got to dig. Constance, it's all you.
Yeah, I think the cool part about what Lyndsey is saying is that this notion that reproductive justice is new, it's new in terms of being a formal, newer in terms of being a formal movement, but the Bible being something that could speak to a more broad existence and experience of people in it is not new, right? So we see here that justice has always been a part of the text, and the tradition, and particularly the lives of people of color. And we can utilize this read, approaching our biblical text and tradition through the lens of reproductive justice. As Lyndsey has shown you, there's places where we can make these inroads. And there's a really great example for inroad for us to make, which is looking at Mary, the mother of Jesus. I'm not sure why Mary's last name is not Mary of Nazareth, but today we won't call her Mary of Nazareth. And if we remember the text, so I'm just going to read this because I'm Baptist and I like to read the Bible. So if you look at Luke chapter 1 and you see the story, this telling of Mary, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent by God to a town in Galilee called Nazareth to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. She came and he came to her and said, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. The angel said, "Do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And now you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, and he will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his ancestor David. He will reign over the house of Jacob, and to his kingdom there shall be no end." And Mary said to the angel, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" And the angel said to her, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you, and therefore the child will be born. And therefore the child to be born will be holy. He will be called the Son of God. And now your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month for her, who was said to be barren. For nothing will be impossible with God." Then Mary said, "Here I am, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word." And then the angel departed. So in this text, we just came through the Christmas season. All right, so we spent a lot of time probably with this passage and passages relating. This text is a really great place for us to pull out things around reproductive justice. First we see the big things we see are, first let's thinking about first who Mary is, right? Again, we read this narrative a lot in our churches. We don't talk about Mary being a young Palestinian woman. We don't necessarily talk about we talk about her being on this camel or donkey, going back and forth in the places. But she is a young Palestinian woman who is having to navigate an environment that is unjust and that is hostile to both her and her pregnancy. She's being forced to travel for governmental purposes, right, during the uncomfortable months of her pregnancy. She's being threatened by government, and it's been framed as a threat, right? So we have to keep in mind that Mary is not traveling just because she wants to go visit a family member or because she's bored, right? They are running, they are hiding from Herod and from opposition to this child being born. And they're running with the knowledge that in the past, this is not a new thing for the government to seek out to kill and murder children, right? There's historical precedent for there being violence against people's children for the sake of the empire. So she's a refugee. She's forced to flee. She and her family are forced to flee. That right there is a great, again, opportunity for us to talk more about other folks who are forced to flee and who are navigating life and pregnancies under the threat of government and, again, unsafe communities. But not just, so social location matters, and it helps for us to enflesh the text in this way because it brings us into it differently, right? It helps us to be able to relate to it in a different way by actually imagining these folks as human beings and living in a context. The other thing that's really cool about this passage, and one of the resources we've given you, it's in the handout, is this document from Soulforce. It's called, I don't know, I can't see it because it's minimized, Mary's Choice, a new model for biblical motherhood. And this resource is super cool because it takes this passage and builds a reproductive justice framework around it, right? For us to talk about a healthy way for us to talk about pregnancy. We see that the angel comes to Mary, and then there's a conversation about this potential. Not that Mary wakes up pregnant, right? It's that Mary has the opportunity to be fully informed about what's about to happen, to ask questions and be in resistance, but ask questions and to interrogate the angel. And the angel responds to those questions. And then Mary says, "Be it unto me." Okay, sure, I'll do it, right? It's a beautiful model about the importance of bodily autonomy, about being able to be fully informed of what's going to happen and have the right to say yes or no regarding that path. This is in our text, right? Like this. So again, I want to reiterate that reproductive justice is not like some different offset of things, or you don't have to kind of make up a whole new arm of the church or arm of your theology to incorporate it. It's there, right? It's looking at the text through a different lens to hear the voices differently. So again, this is a great example of a person coming to their own conclusion about their pregnancy. This is a private matter between her and God, right? So there is no conversation between the two of them, but what her mama would say, what the judge might say, what her best friend might say, what her ex-boyfriend might say, what the lawyer, like there's no other conversation happening in this passage except for between God's ambassador, this angel, and Mary, this teenager, chilling in her room, minding her business. And so that makes it, again, and then the other thing about this passage that's beautiful too is what the angel tells her is, by the way, your cousin is also pregnant. So in case you were wondering if impossible things are possible, let me just give you this example that your cousin who is said to be barren is now pregnant as well. So not only is there this fully informed of what might happen to you, it's also infused with the possibilities that like this is a big shift. It's not just you, it's God's doing something to this community is getting ready to experience a shift. And which again is really important for me with reproductive justice is that we continue to underline the community connection part of it. We don't do this alone. And the outcomes of what happens when we engage with reproductive justice has the potential to transform, right, large communities in the world. All right, so we have like 5 minutes left before our slotted time, which again, we definitely want to hear from you all, and we have time to do some Q&A if folks can stay a little longer. But I just want to stop real briefly and just hear if folks have thoughts, reactions, comments, questions before we kind of do some concluding. And you're welcome to put stuff in the chat or come off mute. How are you feeling, or any questions, comments, thoughts, reactions? Does what we're saying make sense? Let me just start there. Do folks feel, does it make sense, the concept? Alexis, I see your comment. I really appreciate the framework and the emphasis around on Mary's autonomy. Yes. And again, I encourage all of you to check out that resource, the Soul Force document. Super helpful for how to, again, bridge this around a justice issue. Amy said, I'm so deeply appreciative of the ways you're connecting this world-changing framework to our faith tradition. Thank you. Carol says, the Magnificat also talks about creating a world where you could raise a child. So the next slide is that, right? Great transition. So the other part of this text is that what you've just said, Carol, is highlighting as well the justice aspects of what this child will do, can do, and how her pregnancy, it gives evidence, right, to creating creating a world where a child could thrive. So again, the Song of Mary is another wonderful example of where reproductive justice framework can be reflected in the text. Addie, I see your question. How should we as the church have conversations around singles who intentionally choose to have children? That is a great question. In the reproductive justice framework, I think there is a space for that answer, right? And talking about people have the right, whether they're partnered or not, to have children, to choose to have children. I think Mary still is a good example. I mean, is Mary betrothed? Yes. But the angel doesn't mention Joseph in his conversation with Mary. Joseph has a different conversation as it's told. But this is literally between her and Jesus. I mean, her and the angel. So I think you could talk about that in terms of, even if you're single, the question around your reproduction is between you and God. And then the other people that you may choose to invite into that conversation. Lyndsey, Godwin, what do you think?
I think the other thing that comes up for me as I think about this is like, so one, we can't always one for one be like the Bible says or some other thing says this is what we should do now. But I do think about the ways in which Jesus challenges shaming and challenges the idea of like fitting into the cultural expectation being the most important thing. Like, so with Jesus and the woman at the well, right? Jesus does not shame the woman at the well. Jesus, in another situation, there's a woman going to be stoned, and Jesus is like, for what, basically? Like, why? You all also have never done anything that you maybe would make a different choice about. So I think about those things, and then that makes me come back and be like, well, why has quote unquote the church, particularly like the white American Christian version of church, said what it said about single people? Why has that been our cultural norm? Why has that been what's going on? Why has shame always come along with that? Who is served by that? It's generally not actually for the well-being of our communities. So what does it mean if we like pull apart or like challenge the shame idea and think a little bit more different, a little bit more broadly, a little bit differently? So I start with that Jesus challenging shame piece, and then I look at the ways in which reproductive justice says maybe there's more for us to understand that's more important than fitting into the cultural norm that we have ascribed to for a while.
And yeah, thank you. I agree with that. I think shame is another tool of control over women.
And
I am convinced that if Jesus were to come back right now, like to visit, like not to like end the things, but to come back to visit, that Jesus would articulate a new theology around sexuality, because I think, again, we keep trying to fit into a norm that has shifted in terms of socially and like needs of community. So I think that we know more and more single people are choosing to have children. I think it begs the question around like, what's the benefit of marriage? Like, what's the benefit of marriage? And like all these big questions that come up, and why do we push that for people? And shame, yeah, is absolutely a huge part of social control. Absolutely. But yeah, I also think the conversation, we have to shift a conversation about like contemporary community norms or contemporary social norms.
Addie, I see your follow-up comment, and I think that this also just points to the if I'm reading it correctly, the range that we still have within the Alliance, because I've been in congregations where we wouldn't even, this wouldn't be a question. We wouldn't worry about single people being in leadership positions, single parents being in leadership positions in the congregation. Because it's not a thing, like, because we're in a different place. So I think what you are naming is like which is really important for where you are. And so I would ask you to think about like, well, what feels important for you, and where might you be comfortable pushing or wondering or bringing curiosity to that, and who might you be able to be in conversation with in your community around what does it mean? How shame may be playing a role. What are we at the core? What do we want for leaders, and what does reproductive justice maybe have to say about that?
Well, I guess what I want to point out is that there is a range in the Alliance, extreme range when you look at particularly some of the African American churches in the South. My mother had often told me about, when a girl would get pregnant, the deacons would actually bring her up to the front of a Baptist church and literally shame her in front of the entire congregation. And this still goes on, maybe not to that extreme, but what happens is that people are pushed to the background. They're pushed to the back, so they're no longer singing lead in a choir, teaching Sunday school, or I'm not saying they drop out of church. And this is going on right here in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Yeah.
So it is, I think it makes a big difference for predominantly African American congregations versus predominantly white Baptist congregations. It's a huge gap as far as I'm personally concerned and what I've seen. So it's not old school. It's a lot of people, and I personally don't have a problem calling anybody on it. I'm here just to learn some of the theology behind some of the things I already believe. So
That's real. That's absolutely real.
Yeah.
And thank you for naming those nuances. I think you are absolutely right. And in terms of like the complications of that, and Constance, I will open this up to you adding things, obviously, but I also think about the ways in which there's a whole conversation happening now for folks who are younger around the ways in which that the impacts of things like that, whether it is the example that you're talking about specifically in the Black church, or other ways in which congregations shame and belittle and demean young people because they are effeminate, because they have a disability, like whatever the thing is that might be othering, and the ways in which people are pushing back against that. They are like that. It's a reason why they might leave the church or the faith. And I think that reality is consistent across a whole host of congregations, in addition to the specifics that you are naming around Black church history and Black church and some norms in some Black congregations.
Yeah, I see that there are a number of people who need to go, and so if anyone needs to jump off, this is a great time to do so. If folks want to kind of stay and chat a little bit more, just a couple of follow-up discussion questions, or just kind of questions, you're welcome to do that too. I just want to reiterate a couple of things that reproductive justice framework is going to be new to some people. It's going to be something that takes time for some folks to wrap their brains around. This is not a quick fix. This is, again, a framework that has to be applied through faithful prayer and building of relationships and things like that. Lyndsey would say we're in deep waters, right? This is the deep part. And that it's not a social justice arm. Like I said, it's not an external thing that that we're inviting churches and faith communities to take on, like another cause. Again, it is a rebuilding of a framework and how we approach things, how we live our lives every day. And then also, like, hopefully this knowledge and this information helps us to think about more about what it means to thrive for all, what that commitment to living that out looks like, and what types of transformation is necessary to get there. It's an invitation to curiosity, to relationship building, to making mistakes, self-exploration. Yes, sometimes speaking truth to power, which is also part of that Ethiopian's experience. And really important that we resist this white savior complex, right? That once we start to learn about these issues of injustice, that we resist the need to kind of show up and be like, we're going to fix this, right? It is an invitation instead to step back and to listen differently, to listen to the voices of people of color, particularly women, femmes, and gender diverse folks of color around these issues, and to transform our assumptions around sexuality and faith as well. Again, to reiterate the handout that we have attached, it's in the chat. It's a great number of resources, additionally, of organizations who are also trying to live out their call faithfully to God and to justice through thinking about reproductive justice as well. Those are also great resources to check out and see how those folks are navigating these waters. And again, just other resources that will be helpful.
Alexis is kindly dropping the links that she needs to drop in the chat, so I want to give you a minute to close up. Thank you for being patient.
No problem. Thank you both so much. Yeah, I just wanted to drop these in the chat so you all can see. I don't have quick access to the handout, but Lyndsey and Constance, if you want to re-drop that in, that's totally fine. I'm just going to drop this other link in. I'm going to share my screen quickly just to share about some upcoming things for the Alliance of Baptists and the Thrive cohort. I'm not sure how many of us on the call now is a part of the Thrive cohort, but we have some upcoming workshops that we want to do a little bit of a deeper dive into the anti-racism and justice efforts that we've been talking about. So this is for Thrive cohort folks only, but we'll have, well, let me start with the Prophetic Imagination. That's for everybody. So the next Prophetic Imagination will be on March 21st at 7 p.m. And we'll be talking about disability justice from a theological lens with my colleague, Reverend Dr. Milton Keys. And then we are rolling out Thrive workshops. So this is open to the Thrive cohort. And so if there are congregations who are part of the Thrive cohort and then you want to invite other people from your congregation, this is open to you. Our first workshop will be on congregational history with Greg Jarrell, who just wrote the book, Our Trespasses, White Churches and the Taking of American Neighborhoods. And that'll be on Friday, March 8th from 4 to 6:30 p.m. Greg is also an Alliance of Baptist minister. And then on March 23rd, we'll have a workshop on abolition with Lauren Jones Mayfield from Highland Baptist Church, which is a part of the Thrive cohort. And that'll be on Saturday, March 23rd from 9 to 12. So the registration for congregational history is now open. There is a $10 fee that'll go to the Racial Justice Fund. And we'll need at least 10 people registered for each workshop to move forward. So if you're part of the Thrive cohort, I would encourage you to register and also invite other folks from your congregation to join. And then lastly, I was asked to share this giving information. The Alliance of Baptists is turning 37. So it's Alliance of Baptists 37th birthday. Shout out to Alliance of Baptists. So from February 12th through the 28th, all donations will be matched by a generous donor up to $5,000. So I dropped the donation link in the chat to help us continue the work. Also, I also say that the annual gathering is taking place from April 12th to the 14th in North Carolina. So if you all are interested and able to make it, that is open to everyone, and I encourage you to be there. That is all of my church announcements. Lyndsey and Constance, if you have anything else you would like to add, feel free.
Constance, anything
Well,
else? Oh, go ahead.
Lyndsey,
Or any questions? I'm sorry. I'll open
Yeah,
up for
sorry,
questions. Go ahead.
this is Doug. Thanks
Doug.
so much. Thank you so much for the journey that you've traveled and sharing with us your insights. This has been amazing. So appreciate you. Appreciate you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Blessings.
Thank you.
Keep up.
Blessings. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll have a follow-up email. Thank you, Constance and Lyndsey. Look forward to staying in touch.
Yep.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Good night.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
All right. Do y'all like to debrief? Or would you like to just have the rest of your night to yourself?
First off, I would say, can you stop the recording?
I sure can.